Okay, for our final segment, I'd like to take a look at Romans, specifically Romans 5, one of the many places in that letter where Paul reveals that he is a very much a salvation historical thinker. Turn with me to Romans 5, verse 12, uh, where Paul says, "Therefore, as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all men sinned." Now, if you take my Romans course, I'm going to actually take some issue with that translation. But nevertheless, let's just move on to what my main point here that I want to make in verse 13 is sin was indeed in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Verse 14, yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even though over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who was the type of the one who was to come. Now, we've obviously talked a lot about Adam Christ typology in the course, and verse 12 is traditionally taken to be the primary supporting text of the church's dogma of original sin, this belief that we're born without the sanctifying grace that we need in order to achieve our beatific end. So those two things we can take as read, I think. But in verse 13 is very interesting when he says here, sin was indeed in the world before the law was given. So between the time of Adam to Moses, there was sin, obviously. Okay, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Interesting. So if you're to ask yourself, what's one of the functions of the law for Paul? If we were to tease out a little bit some of the implications of this, one of the functions of the law is to count up sins. To count up sins. To make Israel aware of what sin is, but in some ways to tally them up, almost like in terms of an adding machine. Why, though? That's really what's so interesting about this. Why would God give a law that in effect leads Israel to sin? And that's indeed what Paul goes on to argue here. If you jump ahead to chapter 5, verse 20, just a few verses down, look at what he says here. Law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. Wow, think of that. Law came in order to increase the trespass. Wait, who gave the law? It was God. And why did he do it? To increase the trespass? I mean, some scholars are so bothered by this that they in effect want to amend the usual meaning of the Greek text to say something like, sin came in and as an unfortunate result, trespasses increase. But that's not what the Greek says. And moreover, if you jump ahead to Romans 7, and I'm not going to have time to look at it here, but read that in detail, where you see this person I talking about Paul. Paul's really speaking I in terms of representing all Israel, wrestling with the law in his sort of fleshly, mortal humanity. That, yeah, that's indeed the effect of the law. The effect of the law is to increase the trespasses, and this is indeed exactly what God knew would happen. But the question is why? Why would he set Israel up to fail in this way? Well, this is one of the things that really gets fleshed out in much greater detail in the section of Romans 9 through 11. And this is all about really understanding Israel's sacred vocation in salvation history. What was Israel meant to do? Was Israel meant to, in effect, fail? Well, actually, in some ways, yes. And how has this happened? Well, it gets very deep and very dark and very murky in some ways. But in effect, what Israel is meant to do, and this is really her mission, in some weird, mysterious sort of way, is to, in effect, shoulder the burden of sins for who? Of her own sins, yes, but we know, reading what Paul just said, that all sins are ultimately derived from our what? From our dependents, our descendants from Adam. Israel is uniquely called, being under the law, to shoulder the burden of Adamic sins for all humanity. Why? Why? Why would God do this? Ultimately, so Jesus Christ, the new Israel, can come and pick Israel up, the old Israel, weighted down by the sins of humanity, and take out those sins at their source by dying on the cross and ultimately allowing the Abrahamic blessings to flow. Okay, now that will get you thinking, hopefully. So I'm not going to actually get into all the permutations of how we can see the way that this argument works out. It's going to be detailed, and you really have to take the course on Romans to figure it out, just to really see it. It's very detailed, and we spend 2 whole weeks going through Romans 9 through 11, trying to make sense of this. But indeed, there is a unique vocation, and the unique vocation of the law, one of the aspects of the vocation, not the only one, but is in effect taking the burden of fleshly humanity and ultimately setting the stage for how Jesus Christ, the new Israel, the true Israel, can in effect come and take those burdens away, in effect, by shouldering all of them to himself as the new Israel, thereby taking out the sins at the source, dying on the cross, and releasing to everybody the Abrahamic blessings, in effect fulfilling God's vocation through the children of Abraham, that is Israel. Okay, I'm going to stop now. I don't want to make this any more difficult than it needs to be, because this is the first time many of you are exposed to this. So if we could, let's stop there, and we will hopefully have a chance to talk more about this in the coming weeks of the course. Okay, have a good evening.